organizing this program. Uh, Good morning, everybody. I Firstly, I welcome Dr. Shomobrata Rai for being available to us. And I know that it's late evening in his place. It's almost, I think, 12 o'clock night. Is that Shomobrata? What is the time now?
Yeah, I think it's now 12:10. Yeah, 12:10
Okay.
night.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's very nice that he has agreed uh, for this presentation, because now we know that this area is a very emerging area, and our scholars, JBNST scholars, are always enthusiastic to learn all the emerging research of the globe of this planet. So at this platform, uh, today, I think we have already covered at least 15 seminars at the webinar for our scholars. So we are utilizing this pandemic time very well. And I see that in every seminar, our scholars are very enthusiastic and they interact a lot with the students, with the speakers. So I know that today will be a very enjoyable seminar. I welcome Dr. Shomobrata Rai and I request Dr. Abhijit Kaur to host this program and to introduce the speaker today.
Thank you, Mitridi. Uh, Let me introduce Dr. Roy in very brief. That Shomobrata did his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, Bangalore, JNCSR, to be very well known. And before that, he completed his PhD from Masters from IIT Kharagpur and Bachelor's in Chemistry from Presidency College, Kolkata. It was college at that time. Now it's Presidency University. So everybody, all of you are very much aware that the biggest crisis of today's world is to get the energy. We are lacking energy, and the natural source of energy is gradually diminishing. So we have to find out some source, and Shomobrata is essentially working on that field, that how we can get energy out of carbon dioxide, and integration of photovoltaics, electrocatalytic platforms, seawater, all these sources, how carbon dioxide can be utilized for meeting our energy. He belongs to Calcutta, and currently all of you are aware that where he is from right now. I'm asking the participants. Hello, am I audible? Have you seen the flyer that you have been provided with regarding his current affiliation? You have not gone through the flyer. Well,
সবাই চ্যাটে লিখছে অভিজিৎ,
okay,
সবাই
okay.
চ্যাটে লিখছে রাইস
Okay,
ইউনিভার্সিটি।
আমি চ্যাটটা দেখতে
ওদেরটা
পাচ্ছি না
মিউট।
বলে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি। রাইস
So,
ইউনিভার্সিটি, টেক্সাস সবই লিখে দিয়েছে। ওদের
yes.
আসলে মিউট করা আছে, তো ওই জন্য ওরা ইয়ে করছে না, কথা বলছে না।
So
Very good.
Shomobrata is from Rice University, Texas, a very well place where he has started his postdoctoral research recently, and will be very eagerly waiting and listening to his talk, that how carbon dioxide can be utilized for meeting our future energy resources. With this introduction, I request Dr. Rai to start with the session.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Kaur, for the nice introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present some of my views and some of my work in front of such enthusiastic students. So it's already a little bit late in US, but I would try to be as enthusiastic as you are in telling some stories of projects that I have conducted during my PhD and postdoctoral tenure. So as you might have known by now that my name is Shomu Broto Roy. So I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at Rice University, Texas, in USA. I work with a professor whose name is P.M. Ajayan, and she's one of the leading material scientists in the world right now. And and the title of my talk today is The Boon of CO2, and I will elaborate why I framed the title in such a way during the course of my presentation. And another thing is that if you have any questions in between, because I'll show some scientific data and some analysis to you. So if you have critical question regarding understanding those, please feel free to stop me and ask questions. However, if those questions are more generic and more trivial, then I would prefer that you ask the questions after my talk is over at the end of it. So as Dr. Kaur already mentioned, I went to a school in South Calcutta, which is called South Point. At one point of time, when I was there, this used to be the largest school in Asia. Then after completing my school, I went to Presidency College to study chemistry as my major. And after that, I moved to Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, to pursue my master's studies. From there, I went to an institute, a research institute, which is one of the premier research institutes in India, located in the southern part. It's in Bangalore, and it's called Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, or in short, JNCSR. And the person that you're seeing on screen is the founder of the institute. He's one of the scientific pioneers and scientific administrator in India. His name is Professor CNR Rao. If you may not know, he received the Bharat Ratna the same year along with Sachin Tendulkar. We have been fortunate enough to be enrolled to his department, and he was my departmental chairman. And we were blessed with his presence and a lot of good interactions that inspired many people like me to pursue science as a career in future. So this is a campus of JNCSR. I mean, it's one of the most modern architectural campus that you can find in the country. And it's a it has wonderful infrastructure. And the thing that you see here on the right is basically one of the building design. If some chemistry students are there, they would understand that this particular railing that you see projecting towards the sky is basically replicative of the structure of fullerene, for which two scientists from Rice University actually got the Nobel Prize in chemistry. It is one of the path-breaking discovery in structural chemistry. And then after my PhD studies in JNCSR, I moved to Rice University to pursue my postdoctoral studies. And you can see here like the campus images of Rice. It's located inside in the town of Houston in Texas. We have a very beautiful campus. Rice is a small school, but it's very beautiful and does very advanced research in US. And this is the picture on the right shows where I work. It's near to my lab. And as you can see, this is a graduation day, I think, where convocation is happening. On the right-hand side, bottom corner, you can see, I mean, Rice has a very strong presence of Indian students, and we celebrate a lot of cultural festivities, Indian festivals here at Rice, and this snapshot was taken in one such occasion. So with this brief introduction, I'll come to today's topic. And as I told you, so today I'll be talking about the boon of carbon dioxide. So we know that in the pre-COVID-19 era, if we list out the biggest challenges that human society was facing, climate change would probably rank at the top of that list. And the reason because we for any energy derivation from any resources, we use this particular reaction where you can see here there's a general formula of hydrocarbon which reacts with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, and water. And because the forward reaction is very spontaneous, this reaction releases some energy which we utilize for our everyday needs, in starting for say for example electricity, to drive cars, fuels, or anything that we do around you in some way utilizes this central reaction, which produces carbon dioxide. And since the industrial evolution, I'll show you a data later on, but since the industrial evolution, human society has primarily depended on the fossilized fuel sources, which exist in the form of gas, natural gas, oil, or coal. Particularly, India and China are two countries which whose energy infrastructure is strongly based from coal, and this has led to enormous increase in CO2 emissions. So here, if you can see that during the ice age, which was some 400,000 years ago, so you can see that the global or over a century, the curve of carbon dioxide emission is kind of constant. So you can draw a straight line to see that almost it's kind of a median between the fluctuations. But since the industrial revolution happens in the late 19th century, 1860s or so, it led to enormous increase in global CO2 in the atmosphere. And due to these activities and from various countries, what we see is as of 2020 April, the ppm level of CO2 in atmosphere has almost reached to 400 ppm, which is a very deadly value in terms of CO2 concentration, because pre-industrial revolution era, this value used to lie somewhere between 250 to 300. So you can understand the enormous increase, and what this has effectively led to, as you know, a very common phenomena which is called the greenhouse effect, and this has led to an increase in the global land ocean temperature index by almost 1 degree over the last couple of centuries. And so in the last century, we saw a rise of around 1 to 1.5 degree Fahrenheit. And if this value sounds small to you, then let me tell you that the temperature difference between the modern times and the last ice age was 9 degree Fahrenheit only. So of course, this is a scary situation, and to prevent the calamities that may follow out of these, there has been several international conventions which tried to restrict the global CO2 emission, and one of the notable conventions was the Paris Agreement, which basically told us that we have to restrict our emissions to an extent so that the global temperature rise over till 2050 should be restricted between 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit, which is a tremendous challenge in this growing society. And here we can see some of the implications. So these are some of the glacier images. You can see that before during the industrial revolution and post-industrial revolution, how the ice glaciers have melted, and this has caused and severe climatic changes. We can see random droughts that actually affect our agricultural productions. We have seen several natural calamities in India itself in the form of Ayla cyclone and things which affect human lives on a daily basis. And so I would like to quote a very famous Saudi Arabian oil minister who said that the Stone Age did not end for the lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil. So with this, I will move to kind of the solutions that we can envision in today's world to tackle this problem of CO2. So in my view, there are three particular sectors that kind of drives our society in terms of energy expenditure, and all of these sectors of energy, mobility, and environment are very closely intertwined, and they have overlaps and a common point where technological innovations need to target. So, and the way forward is basically to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere by capturing it from air or from concentrated sources, and then use it through renewable energy to produce fuels for hybrid vehicles or any alternative fuels that may be needed in our energy infrastructure. So I would envision to draw a scheme like this, maybe in near future, 20 years down the line, 20, 30 years down the line, we would like to have an energy economy which represents this schematic, where you have CO2 as one of your primary raw material, and then you have hydrogen. This hydrogen can be produced from various ways, but it's preferable that we use renewable electricity or renewable energy to do the transformation that we seek to do with these molecules. And in one way, we can actually make CO2 batteries or use the hydrogen in fuel cells to go towards e-mobility, where basically you see nowadays, you must have heard of Tesla. Tesla is one of the primary manufacturers of electric vehicles in US and all around the world. There are some other companies as well, but they're the leading. And so they use battery-driven cars. So basically, they are using batteries to produce the energy that is required to drive the cars. Or other side, you could actually use CO2 to form fuels like methanol or other useful chemicals that can complete the material value chain. And you might not be knowing, but there has been certain regulations that have already been passed in the parliament, which regulates the use of pure petrol or pure diesel in your car, and it requires a substitution of up to 20% of methanol in your in the fuels in the car, so that we can have a closed cycle loop, and this can drive us towards mobility. Having said that, it is important to mention that CO2, the reason that CO2 is a problem is the same reason why it is so difficult to do something with CO2. So CO2 is globally produced in high concentration because it's a very stable, thermodynamically stable molecule. And if you can see, look at this table, different products that can be derived for CO2, you can see that how energetically negative it is its formation energy, which means that it itself is a very stable compound. It's a linear compound, and which has an sp hybridization, and because of electronegative oxygen atom, there is a little bit pull from either side, which creates a delta positive charge over this carbon and a delta negative charge over this oxygen. That's a chemistry that we can actually utilize, as I will show you in my next slides, to utilize CO2. And this is the molecular orbital diagram. So basically what it tells is how the carbon orbitals and the oxygen orbitals combine with each other. And we can see here two boxes marked in red and green. So the green boxes are basically the energy levels in the CO2 molecule, whose electrons we can perturb to disturb the chemical arrangement in CO2 and use it for different product formations. There are two transformations possible. So one is where the CO2 does not go through any oxidation state change, or in another process where it goes through a redox process where we see the oxidation change on carbon center until its final transformation. So the idea, the first step of CO2 utilization, so it's a very big process. So everything has to be broken down into sub technologies and sub field of research, with each of which requires enough innovation to make it commercially viable. So the first step in utilizing CO2 to close the anthropogenic carbon cycle, basically anthropogenic carbon cycle means the carbon cycle that we have created because of all the industrial evolution on all the human activities. So any CO2 that comes out of human activities can be termed as anthropogenic. And the idea is to capture CO2 and convert it and utilize it in a cyclic process, so that the total emission and total utilization balances each other, so that we can form a closed loop instead of the open loop that exists in today's world, where the human activities have already affected a lot balance in the natural carbon cycle that exists. So here is a small video of the industrial technologies that actually captures CO2 and store it in various formations. So we can see here that with global warming around the developing countries, so total 50% of the man-made emissions are actually coming from fossil fuels. And these are the hubs or highly emitting centers around the globe for CO2 capture. So what we can do is basically take the CO2 from the industrial flue streams and then put it in a CO2 capture plant, which which can actually CO2. So these black dots that you are seeing are actually CO2 molecules, and the green one are the inert materials like nitrogen and water vapor, and the blue particles are the solvent which captures the CO2 and then create two streams, one which is a pure with CO2, and this is the way industrially today CO2 is captured and then finally stored in the Earth atmosphere for very long time periods. So now for capture, so first I will discuss a few materials and few technological advancement in terms of the CO2 capture. And you can see here that there are various processes of absorbing CO2 either from the concentrated flue stream or from the air directly. And these are termed as absorption based, which is basically absorption means that there is a chemical interaction happening between the CO2 and the absorbing substrate. And then you have an adsorption process where it's just physical interaction between the gas molecule along with the solid sorbent or the liquid sorbent that you have. And then finally, we have a membrane-based separation technologies, and then cryogenic. Cryogenic means we use temperature here to separate out the different, based on their boiling points, how we can liquefy these particular gases at very low temperatures and utilize this. And you can see from this pie chart that around the most of the industrially mature technologies in CO2, about 60% of them are basically absorption based, which basically use liquid solvents, and which is not very energetically favorable, because what happens is that when you want to extract the CO2 out of the solvent, because there are chemical interaction, you need to provide higher amount of energy to get the CO2 dissolved of the material that you use. And here are the different percentages of CO2 that you will find in common flue gases. So typically speaking, of all the industrial emission, it ranges from somewhere down to 4% to up to 12% of CO2, while the rest is basically nitrogen, sulfur oxides, water vapor, and things like that. Okay, so before going into showing the materials, I will just briefly describe to you how a physical adsorption process occurs. And as I told you before, that chemisorption process is energetically not that much favorable if you want to reutilize the CO2. So we are looking at solid sorbents, which kind of optimizes a balance between the physisorption and chemisorption process, which leads to high absorption capacity, at the same time a low energy requirements for regeneration. So basically, it's a surface adsorption phenomena where the adsorbent molecule actually interacts physically with the gaseous molecule and adsorb them on its surface. And at equilibrium, the capture capacity of a material is dependent on three factors, which is temperature, the gas pressure that we use, or the concentration of the gases, and the specific surface area of the solid solvent. I'll come briefly to these points during my later slides. So the way it happens is basically, when we have a chemical compound, and we look at its structure, so the atoms that are located on the surface are basically have unbalanced forces that actually, because they don't face the attractive forces all around, like that one atom that is in the bulk of the material. So the surface atom are actually much more sensitive than the bulk atoms, and this unbalanced force is what leads to the adsorption of these gaseous molecules on their surface. And you can see from this potential energy diagram that in chemisorption, the energy of the sorbate material actually decreases, while in physisorption, the distance and the energy remains almost in the equilibrium state. So based on this, there are certain differences between these two processes. So as I told you, the energy of adsorption is much lower in case of physisorption. This process is reversible. Chemisorption is usually irreversible process. And there are many multimolecular layers usually formed in case of physisorption, whether in chemisorption only monolayers are produced. And because of this chemical interaction in chemisorption, naturally this chemisorption process is very specific to the gases that are being absorbed, which is not the case in case of physisorption. Okay, and while we measure these studies, there are various parameters, as I told you, that to measure the equilibrium capacity, there are various parameters that we can vary or keep constant, which actually determines the equilibrium. And few factors are like temperature, pressure, and isostar. And depending on which one of these we are keeping constant, these graphs or lines that you see can be either termed as isotherm, which means isotemperature, which means a same temperature for the entire measurement, or isobar or isostar, right? And so the idea is, so if you want to design, so all the processes, all the utilization processes that I will show you today, basically talks about how we should design materials to for use in those applications, right? So in case of capture, there are two primary criteria that are being utilized. One is the surface area. So surface area means you can actually at the microscopic level, where the level where eyes, like our human eyes, cannot see, you can actually architecture these materials to have high surface area and pores in them. I will show you some images later on. So, and these pores in these materials can be classified into three types. So once it is below 2 nanometers, these are called micropores. If it is between 2 to 10 or 15 nanometer, they are called mesopores, and above that they are called macropores. Now, if you consider a CO2 molecule, if you see the bond length of a CO2 molecule, and while it rotates, it creates a kinetic diameter which lies in the mesoporous and microporous region. So ideally, if you want to selectively absorb CO2 gas from a mixture of flow stream, we would try to have micro and mesoporosity in your material, which you can only visualize with the help of high magnification microscopes. And while you design this material, you also want to have some surface functionalities on the atoms so that they can kind of chemically or interact with the CO2 molecule, not as strongly as liquid solvents, but still there will be some interactions that will impart specificity to these materials or high capture capacity. And while we design a material, there are several parameters that you judge a material by, right? So how effective it is for this process, and some of these are listed here. You can see how much is the capacity, how much is the selectivity, how fast it can absorb or dissolve CO2, what temperature it can absorb or dissolve CO2, how cyclable it is, that is, once CO2 is captured, how many times can you use the material, and of course whether the material degrades over time, and what is the effect of temperature and moisture, and finally the cost of the material. Because when you are talking about global scale, you need a lot of materials to make this process industrially viable. And in those scales, cost and scalability of the materials that you are proposing is very critical for industrial success. Before going on to showing some of the data of the materials that I made, I would just briefly give you an idea of how do we measure all these things. So there are primarily three methods how we can measure CO2. The first is called a volumetric method, and it's also known as a Sievert's method, right? So what happens here is that you have a closed chamber which has a dedicated, which is a fixed pressure and temperature inside the chamber. And what you do now is basically you dose a particular pressure of CO2 gas. And of course, all of it might not be absorbed. So some of it will remain in the empty headspace of your chamber. And what will happen is basically it will create a pressure, back pressure. And by measuring this equilibrium pressure of how much CO2 you put in, and how much CO2 is remaining after adsorption, you can actually measure the amount of uptake that a material shows. The same thing can also be done gravimetrically. Gravimetrically means by measuring the weight of the material. So as you can understand, gas is very light, right? Almost you cannot feel the weight of gas in this scale. So what happens is you need very, very sensitive balances for measuring this. And one such balance is called a magnetically suspended balance, which is used in one of the instrument that is shown in the B. So it's called a Ribotherm instrument, and it has a magnetically suspended balance that you are seeing below. So you put the material inside this jar, and once you put some amount of CO2, if it is absorbed, there will be a weight change, which you can measure as a function of temperature or pressure. And the left hand side and the right hand side images are basically volumetric methods where you can regulate temperature and pressure. And basically, as I told you, it measures the CO2 capture by Sievert's process. And this is a graph that is taken from literature of the materials that have been reported so far and are kind of state of the art in CO2 capture. And you can see here on the y-axis we have capacity. Capacity means how much of CO2, which is expressed in millimole per gram of the sorbent that you are using. And on the right hand side axis, horizontal axis, we have temperature. So basically, ideally one cat you would like to have one of the solvent materials which is located at the top left corner of this graph, because it will have high capture capacity and the lowest temperature requirements. And there are different types of materials that have been explored so far for capturing CO2. There have been zeolites, which is porous metal oxide. You can see these pores through which CO2 can percolate. Then you have organic inorganic hybrids, which utilizes chemical amine polymers to react with CO2. We have oxides, metal oxides, some other materials. Then activated carbon. Activated carbon is one of the, mainly the materials that I will be showing today is basically can be put in the class of carbon materials. So I'll come to this later on. And over the time, over the last 1 decade or so, there has been a lot of progress in developing technologies which can capture CO2 directly from air. And here you see a list of these companies across the globe, but the efficiency of these particular technologies that have been established is not so good that it will make economic sense for capturing CO2 directly from air. So with that, let me show you one of the setups. So I told you about 2 setup, right? One is volumetric, one is gravimetric, and this is called a dynamic flow setup, which I designed. And it looks complicated, but essentially it's very simple. So here you have different storage cylinders for CO2, nitrogen, and oxygen, and these come to different gas lines. And then you have a reactor chamber here, which have your material in its fixed bed, right? And what you do is basically you pass this stream through this particular reactor, which contains your material. And by measuring the amount of CO2 by certain analyzers before and after this process, you can actually measure how much uptake of CO2 has happened. This is particularly important for direct air capture applications, because if you are aiming to capture CO2 directly from air, effectively what you have to do is you have to pass this air through your material by use of certain big exhaust fans, and your material has to capture the CO2 in a very dynamic condition. This setup is typically replicative of such measurements. And now, as I told you, I will just give you a little chemistry perspective of how we envision to capture CO2 in our materials. So here you can see a support. I will come what support this is, but what we can see here is basically we can functionalize the surface of these supports by certain chemical groups like amines, hydroxyls, and certain things like that. And preferably we choose the support so that it is hydrophobic, because water is a competitive adsorbent in case of direct air capture. As you know that water vapor is also present in air and is present in much higher concentrations than CO2. So typical concentration of CO2 in air nowadays, as I told you earlier, is around 400 ppm. So what happens is when you are doing this reaction, there can be a transfer of this hydrogen atom which was on the oxygen hydroxyl group to the amine, which can create a positive charge over the amine group, and you have a negative charge over the oxygen. And this particular catalytic cycle can be used to capture and dissolve CO2. And amines are, but amine group are very well known for capturing CO2, and this is the kind of moieties that is used both in solid and liquid solvents for capturing CO2. They can react with the CO2 molecule to form an adduct, which is called the carbamate adduct. And depending on whether we are having a primary amine or a secondary amine or a tertiary amine, the interactions and the energy of this particular complex varies. Right, so this is a chemistry that we are going to use in our materials. And to do that, we have first taken two materials. So this one material that I would like to introduce you to is called graphene. So what is graphene? Graphene is basically a particular morph of a carbon, which you can find in the pencil that we used to use in our childhood, right? So we know that that particular the thing that writes is basically made of graphite. And graphene is basically one atom thick layer of this graphite. So if you take some bulk graphite and then try to kind of separate the atomic layers, what you will land up with is graphene. And this graphene sheet is eventually can roll up to form this structure on the left that you're seeing, which are called carbon nanotubes. So the idea of using this material is to exploit their very high surface area. So graphene and CNTs, because they are nanostructural materials, their surface area is very high. And what we tend to do is basically chemically functionalize this particular materials with certain groups, which I have shown you earlier, hydroxyls and amines, and try to see that how the spatial resolution between these groups actually determines the CO2 capture capacity. And here I am showing you a few results where one of the CNT materials which we impregnated with an amine polymer, you can see this is basically a polymer which has high molecular weight, and it has a lot of amine group functionalities in its structure. So if you can actually modify the surfaces of these carbon nanotubes, which have very high surface area with this amine functionalities, so basically you will be exploiting both physisorption, principles of physisorption and chemisorption to increase your capture capacity. So you can see here one of this material actually can capture up to 50 millimole per gram, which is a very high value at 50 bar of pressure. Okay, so this is one kind of material that I showed you. So there are several other types of materials that I want to show you, so that you can have the idea that these problems might seem very bigger. These are big technologies, but at the end of the at the core of these technologies basically lies a very smaller problem of material design. So I'm just trying to show you how a material scientist or chemist can utilize those knowledges to design materials that can be applied in such technology. So here again, as I told you in carbon capture, one is the most important thing is the surface area. So what we can do to use this surface area is basically we can make aerogels. Aerogels means they are almost like the gel, the jam or the gel that you see in everyday life. But when you dry them, instead of the solvent molecules or the water molecules that give the gel property, you have air. So you can understand when air percolates into your material, if you can imagine a sponge, that if the gas will see a lot of surface area inside these materials, right? Because it's porous, it can go inside these materials and interact with the surfaces. So what we did is that we took some of these aerogels that we synthesized, and then we heated them at high temperatures, as you can see here on the right hand pictures, to create carbon morphologies that looks like the sponge. But as you can see, this is not the typical optical images we usually observe, right? So these are microscopic images. So this porosity that you are seeing is in the microscopic nanoscale regime, and can be only visualized with microscopes. And when you further, so this is called scanning electron microscopy images, the ones on the top. When we go further down, if you want to go even down, so here you can see a lot of materials, right? If you want to visualize one such particular strand of material, which are carbon fibers in this case, you have to go to higher resolutions, higher magnifications, which can be achieved in an instrument called transmission electron microscopy, or well known as TEM. So these are the two microscopic techniques that material scientists commonly use to visualize the materials at a nanoscale. And so we can see here that using 3 different carbon fibers, we could actually modulate the surface area of these materials, which have led to an increased absorption. So these are done at 1 atmosphere. 1 atmosphere is the atmosphere, normal atmosphere. Because we are studying them for direct air capture, atmospheric pressure is much more relevant to do these studies. So we can see here that as per the surface area, their capture capacity is increasing, which is expressed in the y-axis. And also another thing that I would like you to notice is basically when we so this 298, 273 or 253 are basically temperature values. So as you decrease temperature, the capture capacity of this material increases. This is because that the kinetics or the dynamics of a CO2 molecule in gas state actually freezes. So they get more and more localized and interact further with the surfaces to give higher capture capacities. Okay, so these are two materials I showed. Another class of materials is basically bio-waste. Bio-waste is a very interesting class of materials because these are otherwise waste in our society. It can be barks of trees, it can be seeds or something. And if you can properly architecture this material to create porosities as shown in this figure, you can selectively use them to capture CO2 from a flue stream. And here I will give you an example of one such material where we used bark of a particular rubber tree and then formed and then activated and doing some chemical treatment. We actually produced this highly porous materials, which you can see in this SEM micrographs. And this is a particular type of measurement on the left hand side, this red curve, which shows an FTIR spectra. Basically, FTIR spectra is a technique to understand what kind of chemical functionalities you have in your material. So when you shine a particular radiation, which is in the infrared region, your molecular electrons actually jump certain electronic levels, and when they come back to the ground state, they release an energy which gives you this peak. Okay, so this is also known as vibrational spectroscopy. And from this, you can actually estimate the percentage of oxygen and carbon that is in your material. And as you know by now, that this oxygen functionalities are utilized for the CO2 capture process. And here is a data where we can further enhance the capture capacity of this material. This is example of another such bio-waste material, and you can see the waste, the pores here. This was designed like this, and I'm not going into the details. So when I started, I told you that the idea is to create porosity in the range of meso to microporous, which is typically 0 or 0 to 2 to 3 nanometer. And you can see here that on the graph on the right hand side, which actually shows you the pore width. Basically, we have been able to make the materials which are porous in the nano region, which is leading to this high activity of carbon capture. And another material that we also explored here is basically called graphene foam. So what we did is I showed you the single layer graphenes, right? So this single layer graphene, we actually synthesized and into an architecture foamy structure. So it acts as an actual sponge, but the porosity of this sponge is in the nano level or micro level. So you can see here some of the ACM micrographs, how this particular foams look like. And it also shows a very high capture capacity, which can be given as 6 millimole per gram. So what I would like to tell you at the end of this carbon capture part is basically we started from one point where we could see that some of the materials reported are actually operating around 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, as is evident from the right hand side figure, and it could capture at around 6 millimole of CO2 per gram of the material. But by exploiting the strategy, the synthetic strategy that I have shown here, we could actually slowly increase this value, and we could actually reach this high value of 6.5 gram, which is actually happening at a much lower temperature, which is energetically efficient because we require less amount of heat energy to be provided for dissolving the CO2 here. So this is one journey of material design, of how you can draw from the knowledge, chemical and physical knowledge that you have about materials, and try to utilize those in making and designing materials. So with this, I will come to the next part, where I will be talking about carbon capture. And once you capture the carbon dioxide, what you do with it. So one idea initially in old days used to be actually basically store the captured CO2 into the earth atmosphere. But when you do that, there are two negative points about that. The first thing is that when you store them in earth crust, particularly inside oceans, so it used to be happening in the ocean beds, basically there is a particular lifetime that earth's atmosphere can store this CO2. It may be very long, thousands of years, but eventually that CO2 is going to come out. And when they come out, all the energy that we put into the process to capture and sequester the CO2 basically goes in vain. And also that extra CO2 can come to the ocean and actually can change the acidity of the seawater, and which can badly affect the marine or bio life that happens in the seawater. So the best possible scenario is basically to use the captured carbon dioxide and then utilize it through different routes to produce products that can be used in our society, like fuels and chemicals I told you about earlier. And there are various methods that you can adapt to go through such a transformation. And depending on the kind of energy you use to catalyze that particular reaction, it can be divided into different class. Chemical catalysis, where you use other chemicals to bring about this transformation. You have electrocatalysis, which use electrons or electricity to do this. And then you have photo, where you use sunlight. You have thermocatalysis, where you have used temperature. So I will give one small story on each of these catalytic pathways and try to show you how important is material design and basic chemistry for such complicated processes. So for those who know, for those who don't, who are not familiar with the concept of catalysis, basically catalysis is a very old concept which was first coined by Berzelius and Ostwald in the 20th century, early 20th century. And the idea is that when you go from a product, say X and Y are two reactants, and then you go to a product called Z, you can go through a pathway which has intermediates that requires certain amount of energy. Say, for example, y-axis show the energy. But when you use a catalyst, basically it can lower down this energy, or it can lower down the activation energy of your process. And it also determines the pathway through which a product A will be converted to, reactant A will be converted to a product B. And it can also determine the rate or how fast this transformation will happen, right? So the remaining part of my talk will be basically about this design of different catalysts that you can use for utilization of CO2. And there is a very famous quote that was given by Wolfgang Pauli. He was a Nobel laureate. Some of you who are doing chemistry, you will know that we have heard about Pauli's exclusion principle. And he famously told once, God made the bulk, surfaces were invented by the devil. Why he said that is basically, as I told you, all these catalytic or adsorption phenomena, everything happens on the surface. The bulk is, broadly speaking, inert during any kind of transformations like this. So that's why because all these phenomena occurs on the surface, it is very dynamic. Surfaces are very dynamic, and that's why it is very difficult to probe them, which like led him to state this particular sentence, which is God made the bulk, surfaces were invented by the devil. And now how you go about, for example, design a catalyst. So the basic idea is that you have some chemistry or physics fundamental knowledge, and based on that you initially design a material, and then you test it to see how the activity is coming. Say, for example, molecules like water, CO2, N2, which are abundant in our atmosphere, can be utilized through catalytic process to produce fuels that we actually use. And how active one catalyst is basically done by catalytic screening. And what we effectively do is we make a catalyst, we do these studies, and then we try to establish from different kind of experiment the structure activity relationship between this catalyst. Say, for example, why a particular material is showing a particular catalytic outcome. And from that, you take some knowledge which you conduct in iterative loops to actually derive at a formula which give you the best result. So that is how any catalytic process goes about, and discoveries of new catalyst happens. And to do that, there are several avenues. So so basically you have, say, for example, if you see these two curves on the top, basically it tells that in particular there is a theoretical prediction that a material can be so much catalytically active. But in practice, we often see that this is not the case, because there are several limitations that happen in the actual scenario. And so what we can do is we can modify our catalyst in various forms to achieve at our targeted theoretical activity. And to do that, what you can do is you can play around with the shape of the catalyst, because this particular, each of this shape actually exposes different kind of surfaces to the chemical reactant. And as I told you, all the reactions happen at the surfaces. So what surface is exposed is function of what morphology of the particles you make at nanoscale, and that effectively determines your catalytic activity. Or you can basically take this material and then graft it on various kind of supports. It can be carbon nanotubes, it can be graphene, it can be several other materials that you can utilize. What basically this does is it increases the effective surface area of your material. Or you can do some nanostructuring. So instead of this bulk or say, for example, solid particles, what you can do here, you can make it porous, you can make it rod shaped, you can make it very thin, and all these have effect on your catalysis. So this left hand side is something which is extrinsic properties of the catalyst, and on the right hand side, what you do is by chemical tuning, you play with the electronic nature of your catalyst, and that also leads to certain enhancement in your activity. So, and CO2 as a molecule, why I named this talk as the boon of CO2, that because we always think of CO2 as a villain, as a material that is probably giving us the hardest problem to solve in many years. But at the same time, if you can properly utilize CO2, it can form as many as 17 different products that can be used in our society. And these products can be divided into, as I told you, like carbon monoxide, formic acid, methane, ethylene, etc., etc. And the ones that are highlighted in blue are the one that I have tried to target in my work, because all these are the most valuable in the material value chain. That means the market size and the importance of this material for further downstream processes is maximum. And again, let me come back to the to go to the same reaction that I started with, that this is the reaction that drives all the energy derivation in our society. It produces CO2 and water. Now, the idea is that you are basically trying to reverse the reaction, right? So you're trying to utilize CO2 and put back hydrocarbons or fuels back into your earth. So while you want to do it just by heat, because the forward reaction is very spontaneous and very exothermic, which means it releases a lot of energy. To reverse this reaction without the help of any catalyst or anything, you have to provide an enormous amount of energy. And as you know, whenever we use some energy for a process, it has a carbon footprint of its own. So basically, what will eventually happen is you say, for example, convert back 10 kg of CO2, but by that process, when the amount of energy that you utilize will actually extrapolate to about maybe 20 kg of CO2. So that does not make any sense, right? So you have to decrease, you have to make your overall process carbon negative. So to do that, what we can, instead of doing directly heating without any catalyst, what we can do is we can break down this backward reaction into two different parts. So one is splitting of water. So water can be split electrochemically. I will tell you what electrochemically means, into hydrogen and oxygen and electrons. Now you can basically use this hydrogen and electrons in the water splitting process to electrochemically convert to CO2 to different product. And here you can see ethanol, which is a potential requirement of certain amount of energy. And when you do all the maths, you can see that this particular process is much more energetically favorable than if you wanted to put the reaction backward directly. So the question that we'd like to ask is, can electricity be used to close the carbon cycle? So and how do we do that? So basically, like this is an example of an electrochemical cell. So electrochemical cell has two different electrodes. One is called the anode and one is called the cathode. And in between you have the electrolytes, which are basically used for transporting the ions, because you can understand that once the electron is taken from the anodic side and put to the cathodic side, the anode will get charged, or the positively charged, and the cathode will get negatively charged, right? So these ions are needed to migrate from the cathode to anode to balance the charge. And what will happen is, we will use renewable electricity like wind electricity or solar electricity to power this cell, and we will use the CO2 as a raw material, and we will produce the fuel. So CO2 happens on the cathodic side because it is a reduction process, and water is oxidized to oxygen, which happens on the anodic side. And these protons and electrons that are produced are actually utilized for the reduction of CO2. And this is how our typical electrolyzers look like, commercial electrolyzers. So basically, you can see all these plates, they are parallelly lined up. There are many such particular cells that I showed on the left-hand side corner, and then they are clubbed together to produce a cell which will have certain amount of potential to yield this particular reaction. However, for water splitting or producing hydrogen and oxygen from water, this is a commercially established technology, but it is not the case for CO2, because CO2 conversion is much more difficult process. It's a very complicated process and another multi-step process. And because of that, we need to design suitable cathode materials or reduction catalysts for CO2. And you can see here that, as I told you before, that CO2 can be reduced to different products, right? And when we are talking about electrocatalysis, they occur at certain amount of voltages. So you can see here on y-axis we have volt. So basically, this much amount of electrochemical potential or electromotive force you need to provide for a particular reaction to happen. And the challenge in CO2 is basically, you can see that between a very small potential window of, say, for example, 0.2 to 0.25 to around -0.1, all the products lie in this small potential window. So that means that if your catalyst is not very selective, if you give a certain potential which is above the thermodynamic potential requirement of a particular process, you will have multiple products. And very promising, because you need to conduct extra separation step and things like that. So, but while thermodynamics looks like this, all these reactions are actually happening at different rates. So when you link the rate of a reaction, it is called kinetics, right? So basically, the idea is that can you use the rate of formation of all these reactions to gain selectivity, okay? And to do that, basically you use catalyst. And so you can see this is an uncatalyzed pathway. So you have CO2, you have hydrogen, you have electrons, and you produce, say, for example, the simplest CO2 reduction product, which is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide, you may think that is a poisonous gas, but it has huge industrial applications. It's one of the major raw materials in the chemical industry through a process which is known as Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. So basically, carbon monoxide is reacted with hydrogen in a Fischer-Tropsch process to produce a variety of chemicals that is used in our society. So if you don't have a catalyst, you will have a very high energy barrier, and the reaction pathway will go like this. But instead, if you use a particular catalyst, it may actually have intermediate steps by which it will decrease the activation energy and the reaction pathway of the process. But as I showed you earlier, that when you have these protons, so you have two materials here, right? You have CO2, you have protons. Electrons is your basically reagent here. Now this electron can actually react with hydrogen to or protons to produce hydrogen, or it can react with the CO2 to produce carbon monoxide. So ideally, these two reactions of hydrogen productions and CO2 reduction are competitive when you are doing it in an aqueous solvent, which means it has source of proton. This is also another very critical challenge in CO2 reduction that you need to catalytically tackle. And this is what an electrochemical cell actually looks like. So as I told you, you have these two compartments. One is the cathodic compartment and one is the anodic compartment. And these two compartments are actually separated by a membrane. This membrane is selective to certain ions that can percolate through these membranes from one side to the other side to maintain charge balance. But it won't allow all the chemicals. Say, for example, you know, in case of a full cell reaction, on the cathodic side, reduction happens. On the anodic side, oxidation happens. So if you don't use this membrane, what will happen is the reduced product that you are producing using the catalyst, which is on the working electrode, will basically migrate and come to the anodic side and get oxidized itself. So basically, you will produce again CO2 back from this from these chemicals if you don't stop them from flowing from the cathodic to anodic side. So you need a separator for that, and this is a schematic of such. And when you do an electrocatalysis, there are certain parameters that you have to keep in mind. One is electrolyte. One is what kind of electrolyte is you are using. You have pH, which is basically the concentration of the hydrogen ions. Then you have ionic effects, you have buffer capacity. So because while this reaction happens, the local pH changes, right? And so what happens if your material is not having high buffer capacity, which can absorb the pH change, your local pH will change, and instead of CO2 reduction, you will have more and more of hydrogen evolution. And finally, the cell design, how you design the cell. Everything is very critical for the final performance that we do. So now I am coming to the materials that some of the materials that we looked into, and I will tell you small stories that I've tried to generalize as much as I can so that you can understand. So this is the same carbon fibers that I use for CO2 capture. I have showed you these images earlier in the carbon capture section. So what happens is I use couple of metals that can be actually put in touch with this carbon fibers at a very nano level. So what happens when you do the TM studies after this particular synthesis, you can see that you have all these small nanoparticles that are gathering on the carbon matrix, and these nanoparticles are actually the active center where your CO2 will come, bind, and get electrochemically reduced. And from this result, you can see that Faraday, so what you have in these two graphs on the y-axis is Faradaic efficiency. Faradaic efficiency means that when you provide a certain amount of electricity to a particular electrochemical cell, and you have X amount of product being produced. So if you calculate what is the energy input and output for that particular product, that gives you a Faradaic efficiency, which is expressed in percentage. So if a Faradaic efficiency of a particular product is very high, it means that high amount of the electricity that has been you have given is actually utilized for that process. So you can see here by utilizing two different metals, how the activity changes. On the left hand side, you can, so one I have used nickel, and on the other case I have used copper. So what you can see here that while I'm using nickel, we have actually high production of hydrogen, as you can see from the Faraday efficiency, which is expressed in the pink curve. But while you change it to copper, the activity completely changes. So now instead of hydrogen, it produces a large amount of carbon monoxide, which is the 2 electron reduced product of carbon dioxide, right? So this is one example. Another such interesting example is in a particular chemical, which can be simplified as AbX2. I will tell you what this means. So A means silver, B means indium, and X can be either sulfur or selenium, right? So this is an ordered compound. And what you see here on the left hand side is basically the actual energy diagram that I schematically showed you earlier. So depending on how effective is your catalyst, how easily it can absorb the CO2 on the surface and transfer the electrons, you will have an increase, enhancement, or a decrease in the intermediate energy step. And the lower the energy is, the faster will be the reaction. So that's the idea. And when you have multiple products, you have multiple steps. So basically, instead of one step, then you will have multiple steps in this energy profile landscape. And so this particular compound, you don't need to understand the structure, but what I want to tell you here is that this particular compound can be synthetically tuned to be formed into two phases. One phase is called tetragonal, while the other phase is called orthorhombic. And the way we can understand which particular phase they have crystallized in is basically an experiment which is called X-ray diffraction. X-ray diffraction is one of the most powerful characterization technique in inorganic chemistry, particularly for solid materials. So what you can understand, don't need to see what it says, but you can understand that these two signature patterns of these two materials are different, right? Clearly different. So it means by controlling the synthesis, we can form two different phases of this molecule. And what I want to show you, how by this simple same chemical formula, but just two different structures can modulate your activity. So what you see here is basically a lattice image of one of this material. Lattice image means it's the actual picture in a molecular scale how the atoms are arranged. Okay, so basically what you have here is silver, which is in silver color. You have indium, which is in kind of pink color, and then you have selenium. So they are bonded like this in a chemical structure. Now the difference between these two phases is basically, in one case you have only one type of selenium, because these are crystallographically or structurally identical in the lattice. But in the other case, due to different bonding nature, you have two different types of selenium. So this is a small change in the molecular level, right? But how it affects the macroscopic properties is what is interesting. So what I show you here in the bottom corner is basically called electronic energy of state. Okay, so what you have here is basically, I showed you that molecular level of CO2, right? Because that was for one molecule. Now, if many such molecules combines, as happens in case of solids, what happens, their individual energy levels overlap to create bands. So the one that is on the top is called the conduction band, and one on the bottom is called the valence band, and the zero energy level here is called the Fermi energy level. So basically what happens, in a normal state, all the electrons actually reside in the valence band. And while you provide some energy, the electrons will actually move from this conduction band to the valence band. And as I told you, there are different seleniums in one of these compounds. So you have three different states here. While in the case on the right hand side, you can see you have only one state for transferring the electrons. So this actually reduces the band gap and affects how much amount of charge will accumulate on each of these atoms. For example, if I go to the orthorhombic phase, we can see that the separation between indium and selenium is much low compared to the tetragonal phase where it is much higher. So and the same trend is followed if we move from selenium to sulfur. So now what is the effect of this charge distribution? So here you can actually calculate how this charge looks like in a molecular level by theoretical calculation. So here on the top you have a tetragonal phase, and on the bottom you have the orthorhombic phase, and you can see just because of the amount and the chemical environment around certain atoms, how the charge which is expressed in red and green. No need to understand the details, but what I'm trying to say is all this charge distribution gets perturbed by your neighboring atoms. And because the neighboring coordination environment in these two systems is different, they have different charge distribution among indium and selenium. And what it happens is basically when you have this charge separation, as I told you, CO2 specifically binds on these surfaces, right? And what happens if you have particular charge distribution or charge separation, that can break the chemical carbon and oxygen bond to certain extent, depending on how is the charge separation. And based on that, we can see here that when we have a more charge separation, it leads to four different products. Now the interesting part is that you can see the first two products, carbon monoxide and formic acid, are single carbon products, while acetic acid and propanol are C2 and C3 carbon products. So it is very difficult to form C3 and C2 carbon products, particularly C3, but because they are difficult, because they require higher energy, so you can naturally understand that they store higher energy in themselves. So when you burn one particular molecule of propanol or one molecule of acetic acid, you will give different amounts of energy. So higher the carbon, more is the energy stored in chemical bond. So our target is to form higher carbon products. So we can see by a small molecular level modulation in the charge of atoms, how we can determine or change the course of product selectivity in CO2 reduction. So this is the key takeaway message, is that by tuning the lattice charge distribution, you can yield actually greater than C2 products, which is a very important discovery in this field. Okay, so this goes the story that I wanted to tell about electrocatalysis. The next I will come to photocatalysis. So photocatalysis, so generally, broadly speaking, all catalytic process, there is one particular reagent that actually brings about all the transformation, that is electron. Now, how you create the electron is basically determined by what kind of energy sources are you using. And based on those energy sources, you have categories of electro, photo, and thermo, right? So here photocatalysis means that you have photons from sun, right? Whatever visible light is incident on the earth crust. So what happens is you have, as I showed you earlier, you have two different energy levels. When sun's rays falls on the ground state energy level, what happens is the electron gains energy. And the electron, when it has energy, it has to release that energy, right? So what it jumps from one electronic level, which is the, as I told you, the valence band, to the conduction band. And now once the electron goes there, what you have here, so this is a physical concept which actually does not exist in the true world, is a concept of holes. Basically, holes are basically voids where electron was present earlier. So typically, conventionally, holes are denoted by H+. Don't confuse this with protons. So electron and holes. Now electrons, as you know, can reduce, and holes can oxidize naturally because they gain electron from the raw material. So basically, if you can separate this electron and hole pair by using sunlight, you can use such materials for the conversion of CO2 or for the oxidation of water. Sorry, there is a big problem here. The problem, what happens is that once the electrons get excited, they are not very stable in the excited state. So what electron eventually does is, the energy that it had gained while going up, they release that energy in forms of, mainly in form of light, and comes back to the ground state, and this electron and hole pairs, they merge together. And once that happens, you basically won't see any catalytic activity, and that light that comes out usually is measured in terms of photoluminescence. So it's a particular wavelength of light that comes out depending on the energy gap between your two energy levels. So this is the basic background of photocatalysis. So the idea is to, there are two things here. As I told you earlier, all these CO2 molecules to different products have different energy requirements. That means they have different redox potential. Firstly, just one first takeaway home message is, electrons, just like water, can only flow from higher energy levels to lower energy levels. Electron cannot, provided you don't give any energy. Energy excitation is different, but if you don't spontaneously, electrons can only flow from higher energy level to lower energy level. So now, so the idea is that if you want to reduce CO2, your higher energy level, or the excited state energy level, has to be higher than the redox potential of this particular reaction. And same here, this thing has to be lower than the oxidation potential of water. So there are two criteria now. Firstly, these energy levels of your material has to be located at a certain level with respect to the redox potential of the reactions that you are trying to do. And secondly, the electrons and holes should not recombine. They should remain separate. So with those two ideas, I will go to the design of material. Here I have used two material. One is bismuth vanadate and one is tungsten oxide, right? And we have used different ratios of this. And what we see, and as I told you, X-ray diffraction pattern is the basic characterization technique for confirming the phase and purity of a material. And you can see here the ACM micrograph, here. And here we shine light from outside, and this CO2 is actually converted to different products. And by doing certain measurements, you can actually determine where the band gap lies. And finally, what happens is that the signature of charge separation is basically that this peak of photoluminescence that I was telling you about actually reduces, which we can see in this compound. And the results you can see here, methane is shown in the blue histogram images, and all these materials that I showed you is basically can produce methane from CO2 with very high selectivity. And we determined by various techniques the band edges, or where the energy levels of this material actually lie, to understand what is the mechanism of this material. And what we determined here, that we had two structural components, bismuth vanadate and tungsten oxide. So what happens is that the electron gets excited in the tungsten oxide, which flows to the bismuth vanadate energy level, which again gets excited to do this reduction procedure. So this is a kind of mechanistic study that we need to do to understand how your material is acting. And with that, I will come to the last part, which is called thermocatalysis. So here we use thermal energy or temperature to reduce. So there are different products that can be produced, as I told you earlier, methanol, DME, etc. So we have targeted here methanol because of its utility, as I told you earlier. So these are the kinds of reactions that happens. So you can see these two are the highlighted ones are the primary reactions, and one of which is exothermic while the other is endothermic. And there is a competition between these two reactions which determines how much product you will form. And this is the schematic showing how we design the material. So we take a porous architecture, and then we use two metals here, which is nickel and indium. And this nickel and indium actually reacts inside these pores to form this compound called nickel 7 indium 3. This is a particular inorganic compound. And you can see here that inside this porous materials, how these nanoparticles has accumulated, which are our main catalytically active site. And here you can see the lattice fringes, which actually is characteristic of these materials, which is basically the space between different different lattice planes in the material. And you can see from the ACM micrographs that nickel and indium is present. So the interesting story here is that when we use just pure nickel, we get an 100% selectivity towards methane. So this you can see from this graph. So on the right hand side, blue red axis, you can see the methane selectivity, and at various pressures and temperatures we can see that when we use pure nickel, we always get methane. But we wanted to form methanol. So interestingly, when we actually form these ordered structures of nickel 7 indium 3, drastically the methane conversion changes to methanol conversion. And you can see from this graph that there is certain conversion and selectivity, and the material that we synthesized is actually almost 90% selective for methanol. And also another interesting phenomena that we observed here is basically that during this transformation, the material itself also changes to a certain phase, certain crystallographic phase, which actually is the active motive for doing this kind of catalysis. Now, how you understand what is going on while you are doing reactions like this? And for doing that, there are certain in situ characterization technique. In situ means while you are doing the reaction, how your intermediates or how your chemical species changes at the surface of the catalyst can be probed by this technique, which is called DRIFTS, which is one form of infrared spectroscopy. So here we can see that in case of just the nickel catalyst, we could only identify the carbon monoxide stretching, while in the other case, we could actually see the CH stretching of methane, which actually tells at what point of time methane production starts forming, which we can correlate actually to the formation of the second phase that I showed you. So the story is that due to this pressure and temperature, this particular molecule that we synthesize first transform, and as soon as it transform in operando conditions, we see that this methane and methanol peaks are starting to arise. And this is a time result, which I'm not going to the details. So this is a schematic to show how in one case we have the production of methane, and just by alloying the material with another secondary element, we change the mechanistic outcome to form methanol. This goes the scientific part that I wanted to show you, and now comes the last part, which we'll talk briefly about a little bit of translational research. Translational research means, so whatever you do in lab, say for example, you make so many materials, you develop so many processes, so how you can translate it actually to the larger scale, to an industry. And to do that, we during my PhD, I co-founded a company which is called Breathe with my PhD supervisor and some other colleagues. And we made a CO2 conversion plant. So the overall schematic of the plant goes like this. So we first capture the CO2 from a concentrated flue stream, as I showed you earlier. And then we used hydrogen that is generated by splitting water. And this splitting of water is actually powered by solar light. So you can understand that till this step, we are not using any kind of fossil fuel based sources for this process, energy sources for this process. And then what we do is basically from various processes, we actually have a reactor unit where this CO2 actually gets converted to different products. And one of such products is methanol. Again, in this process, as I showed you earlier, in the thermocatalytic process, we targeted methanol. And so the way it is done is basically iterative loops. The first thing that I showed you at the beginning of the catalytic presentation is that we identify material, we gather knowledge and put them into computational models so that they can develop certain trends. So if you want to understand an unknown compound's properties, this database and this program that we write with the data of already existing material can actually help you understand the properties of unknown materials without doing any experiment, just by giving their structure in this particular type of softwares. So so we looked at various sources of hydrogen production. In our hydrogen is one of the reactant here, and depending on the cost, we saw that probably biomass gasification is the cheapest, because solar hydrogen generation is still is far away, because the capital cost or the solar panels are very expensive. So biomass is currently one of the renewable hydrogens that we can use for this process. And this is a reactor that is similar to the capture process. Only difference is that here we have a very high temperature control, and this reactor can actually take high pressure for reducing CO2. This is an optical image of the bench scale or lab scale reactor that we use, and this is how the interface look like, how you control this reactor from a computer. And so this one was a lab scale, and I also designed a pilot scale reactor, and which was recently commissioned in our facility at JNCSR. So this is the pilot scale reactor. It's almost 3 to 4 human being heights. So it's a big reactor. And the way we designed the catalyst is basically we did this modeling. So what it means here, that as I told you, that when you want to make theoretical models to understand the adsorption, or to understand the catalytic efficiency of a catalyst, what you do is you plot the oxygen adsorption energy and carbon adsorption energy, because you know CO2 has carbon and oxygen, and this creates these volcano curves. You can see these triangles, these are called volcanoes. So depending on where your material lie on this, and remember that this oxygen adsorption and carbon adsorption energy can be calculated theoretically without doing any experiments. So that means once you develop such a model, if you just theoretically calculate the oxygen adsorption energy and carbon adsorption energy, you can actually predict whether a material will be catalytically active for CO2 reduction or not. So the idea is this material should be lying at the tip of this volcano curves that I showed in the red region. Okay, so that's why copper is a very good catalyst for CO2 reduction. And so you break, and if you want to study the mechanism, you do the same process for different intermediate steps, which I have shown you earlier. Now, in industrial catalysis, you cannot just make some powder or some catalyst and use it as it is, because what happens when you load it inside the reactor, the gases cannot flow because the reactor gets choked. So what you have to do is basically you have to process this powder catalyst into certain extrusion. And interestingly, even how much length and diameter of all these extrude that how much you extrude actually can also determine the catalytic activity. And as you know that this lab scale can be done in small reactors that I have shown you here, small reactor vessels. But for when you are scaling up the process, you need to automate all this process because you need to synthesize in large scale. So I designed certain synthetic unit that can actually synthesize the catalyst in kg scale, and they can be extruded through these different instruments that I've shown you to form shapes like this. I'm not going into the details of this, but the idea is here that we used a multi-metallic catalyst, and each of the catalytic site plays a different role in the catalytic process. But no need to understand that. And what we did is this is a schematic of a reactor. The green range is basically where we put the catalyst, and the pink is basically we put some other inert solid materials so that this layer of catalyst can be balanced. And then we pass the CO2 gas through this reactor at certain velocity, which is expressed as WHSV, weight hourly space velocity. You can, so the thing is we pass about 3600 ml per hour of this gas molecule, and then the temperature is maintained at is optimized between 200 to 300. We operate at 50 bar of pressure, and we have different catalytic sizes. The outcome is that after all this catalysis, what we get is we get carbon monoxide as one of the products, but we also get a mixture of methanol and water, because water is one of the byproducts in all these reactions, and along with it methanol is formed, which is our primary target. And this is basically some calculations that shows that the thermodynamic conversion efficiency is about 30%, which means that you cannot go beyond this value because this is thermodynamically limited. So catalytically, what you can do is you can try to achieve as close as to this 30% or 35% value that I showed you here. And what happens is basically you can see that with increasing temperature from 100 to 250 degrees Celsius, we could actually almost reach the conversion efficiency of CO2 about 30%, and also the flow rates have an strong effect on the conversion and selectivity. And here is a video that you can show here that methanol is coming out of the reactor after 4 hours of reaction, and we could produce this liquid product, so we could also give a very high mass balance. That means there was no losses, no mass losses in our process, which is a very important criteria for industrial success. And because of this, actually we participated, our company participated in a global competition called XPRIZE, which is a $20 million competition based in US. And after we built this technology and things like that, we had visitors from this team in US who came and stayed with us here in Bangalore, and we set up our carbon capture plant in a place called Tuticorin or Thoothukudi, which is in Tamil Nadu. And basically they stayed with us at both these places. They saw our technology, and because of the success of this technology, actually we went to the finals of this particular competition, which is going to be happening this year. So as a summary, in this translational research, we synthesize a certain scale of reactors. We synthesized about 50 different catalysts, screened them, and optimized the conditions through thermodynamic studies to arrive at a particular condition which is optimal for our catalyst to maximize the conversion and selectivity for methanol. And this work got a lot of media attractions and also a lot of awards. So we were named the first, like one of the top 100 startups in Karnataka, and we also won some prizes in Clean Equity Forum in Monaco and things like that. And this is so this was our team for building this technology. And always for processes like this, you need a lot of industrial partners, which you can see here on the left. We worked collaboratively with a lot of industries to finally build this technology. And with this, I would come to the end of my talk. So CO2 is a burning problem, but there are a lot of avenues where we can use CO2 to make products and chemicals that, effectively it can be turned into a blessing or a boon instead of a curse that we currently perceive it as. And thank you. I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shomibhuto. And now it's a wonderful talk, and there are a lot of scopes and achievements you have shown. Have you got that XPRIZE at this 50%, 10 million?
Yeah, so actually there were 3 rounds for this competition, and the first so we have crossed 2 rounds now, and we have got some amount of the award money, and now the final stage is going on, and for that we have to build a plant in US and show at actually an industrial level that this particular process is working, and it is making economic and environmental sense.
So yet to be declared right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so clap for that. At least you have got some prizes. Okay, so is now open for the participants. The questions from our participants. Is there questions from our participants, please? তোমাদের কি কোশ্চেন আছে, তোমরা জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাইছো? Shreyoshi Jana is having question. Yes, Shreyoshi.
Yes, sir.
বলো।
So there was a slide which dealing with the avenues heading under this. There was carbon capture, something else. What is homogeneous and heterogeneous chemical method of catalysis?
Okay, yeah. Yeah. I will come there. Yeah, so what we tried to mean here is basically, I think you are talking about this particular slide, right? Yeah, this one. Yeah, so homogeneous and heterogeneous means when you use your catalyst, it can be either in the same phase as your solvent. That means it gets soluble in the particular reaction media that you're using. And heterogeneous means it won't be solubilized in the media, and it will exist as a different solid phase. So the advantage of heterogeneous catalysis over homogeneous catalysis is that it is easy to separate the chemical out, the catalyst out, after you're done with the catalysis.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Sir, what is Faraday efficiency?
Yeah, so Faraday efficiency is basically, say for example, when you're doing an electrochemical reaction, you have two products. You have, say for example, hydrogen, and you have oxygen. Now you have given X amount of energy in terms of electricity. Now y moles of oxygen is formed and Z moles of hydrogen is formed. Now this amount of millimole of Z that is formed, the amount of electricity is required divided by the total energy that you have put. So energy required for a particular product divided by the energy of total energy input gives you basically this value, which is called Faraday efficiency, and that is an indication of how selective is your process for a particular product.
So what is Z for the molecules?
Yeah, so the Z is basically the number of electrons that you would have required for conversion of that much amount of compound.
Yes. Sir, there was a slide within 3 or 5 number of slides, resonating structures of CO2.
Yeah. This one?
Here the below two structures are there. Resonating structures. On the carbon molecules, there would be delta minus or delta plus charges.
Yeah, there will be. So now you can see that the tetravalency of carbon in all these resonating structure is satisfied, right? So you basically have one electron gone from one side to another. But what happens? So you can see in each of these structures we have shown the other bond also falling. So ideally you don't have charges here.
So movement of electron is taking place actually, and it's a resonating structure. So
yeah,
it's not a charged particle.
Okay. So what is activated carbon, and how it penetrates membrane?
Activated carbon means that basically you pyrolyze or heat the carbon at high temperatures with certain chemicals which actually induce porosity in your carbon structure. So as I showed you, many of these structures are porous, right? So that actually happens because the process is called activation, because you are enhancing the surface area of the material.
Yeah, the electrons are energetically high.
No. So that has nothing to do with the electronic structure of your material. Just physically say. So I would say the easy comparison analogy would be you just imagine a block and you imagine a sponge of the same dimensions. That's the change what happens when you activate, when you make carbon activated. So initially you had a non-porous structure, Then once you basically activate it, the chemicals go inside, percolate into the matrix, and once they evaporate, they create porosity. So there is not much changes in electrical properties, but yeah, so you can say that their electrical conductivity increases after activation, because once you treat them at high temperatures, this material actually graphitizes and they become more dense. So electrical conductivity in the material increases.
It's essentially activates, it's increase the active sites. As the porosity increases, normally it's a surface phenomenon, and when you increase the porosity, you are essentially increasing the active sites for the reactions. So that is why it is activated.
Okay.
Yes.
From CO2, can we form the activated carbon?
I mean, you can ideally form activated carbon, but as I told you, so activated carbon is on the other end of the spectrum, right? That is one of the most reduced form of carbon. So basically, you have to take all these gases or compounds, solid compounds, and then you have to put them. But ideally, you can form. Yeah.
Okay. We can penetrate the cell membrane where there is the protein lipid 3 layer.
Now, which one can penetrate? CO2?
No, actually the activated carbon atom or something else like that.
Yeah. So I showed you some examples of nanoparticles and things like that, right? So they can, if they are of below certain dimensions, and they have certain functionalities on their surfaces that can interact with the protein lipid PLP layer on the cell membrane, then they can interact and enter into the cell membrane. It's possible. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I was mentioning that carbon can also do that when you are making very small nano carbon dots. That can also do that. Yeah.
Okay. So you deals with the reactor, pilot scale, or etc. Something else in the last of your lecture.
Right.
What about the reactor?
Yeah.
Are those used in reduction of CO2 from nature?
So ideally not right now, because direct air capture, that means if you want to capture CO2 directly from air, it's not yet energetically favorable process. It requires a prohibitive amount of energy. It requires a lot of energy, which increases the cost. So what we ideally do is we take, say for example, the flue stream out of a industrial plant. It can be any plant. It can be a cement industry, it can be a coal gas industry, and then we selectively capture the CO2 from that and leave out all the other gases, and then we put that CO2 into our reactor.
Okay, Shomobrata, can it be made a portable catalytic chamber like that? Say, for example, if we can use it in the exhaust of cars and all these things.
Yeah. So yeah, we can do that. The thing is that we would, capturing is fine. So for the capture materials are designed like that those are portable and can be integrated into any form of source. But for conversion, ideally we would require some form of energy, and that energy, if it can be derived from somewhere within the car or something, then we can make small portable devices with the catalyst bed which can convert. So
Possibilities are there. Possibilities are there.
Possibilities are there.
Okay. Okay. And another thing, I'll be curious to know that the last but one slide, perhaps, where you have shown in the catalytic chamber, you are putting the catalyst, extruded catalyst. It's a 1 or 2 millimeter size. Next slide, perhaps.
Yeah.
1 or 2 millimeter slide size. So does it affect if you can reduce the size or surface area or something like that?
Right. So what I mean here by 1 to millimeter is basically you can see in this slide this
Extrudes.
particular extrudes, right? So the diameter of these wires. Now
Okay.
you can understand that if you go beyond 1 to 2 nanometer, what will happen is these will be becoming very fragile, and in the pressure of the bed and pressure of the gases, this will basically break down to powder. So there is a balance that we need to maintain between the strength of the extruded and how much we can enhance the surface area, and 1 to 2 millimeters kind of the lower limit for that.
Okay, okay, that's great.
Yeah.
So these are some of the queries I could find. And any other questions from the participants?
I have one more.
Shreyashi again.
Yes. There was a slide, theory of gas absorption.
Yes.
There potential energy diagram. What was that? I could not understand about that.
Okay, I'll show you. I understand what you mean. I think you're talking about this one, right? Yeah. So what it basically means is that uh, the potential energy when in case of chemisorption is much more negative. That means the adduct. So if you see, you have an adsorbate and an absorbing gas. When they chemically react, naturally energy is released, right? So and that leads to a lowering of the energy in the potential well for the chemisorption process. But when you are having physisorption, uh, the reactant, you almost have an equilibrium energy. You don't have extra stabilization energy. The same reason you don't need to give more energy to dissolve the gases from the surfaces.
Okay.
Okay, sir. I have another type of question. Whenever calcium oxide absorbs the CO2 molecules,
Right.
now what is the structures about the CaCO3 molecule?
Yeah. So
Obviously, calcium carbonate is produced.
yeah, so basically they go through a cyclic process where they have calcium oxide, calcium bicarbonate, and then calcium carbonate, and then finally if you heat it at very high temperature, it will again decompose to calcium oxide and carbon dioxide. So what do you mean by you want to understand the calcium hydrocarbonate bicarbonate structure, chemical structure?
Shreyashi?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. What do you mean? Like,
Sorry.
excuse me.
Yeah, tell.
Yes, what you mean?
So what I mean is calcium. So these are ionic compounds, right? Like,
Yes.
so
Yes.
you have Ca plus and HCO3 minus, right? Ca2 plus and HCO3 minus. So basically, you can understand that one oxygen is double bonded and the other oxygen has one O minus H plus. So that's the carbonate bicarbonate radical, bicarbonate anion, and then you have the calcium. So the same thing happens like when you go to calcium carbonate, you have the carbonate anion and you have calcium. So and then when you heat it in presence of oxygen, what will happen? CO2 will come out and it will go back to its pristine form of calcium oxide.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But I
So
know
think-
yes,
Yeah,
sir.
tell.
Yeah.
I know the structure of calcium carbonate, but whenever the calcium oxide and CO2 molecules are come close, then what is the structural difference between the former structures?
Oh, so what happens is that in those kind of reactions, usually water also take a part. So first you will go through basically you'll. So the way it is done is basically you have the actual industrial processes. You make a calcium hydroxide solutions out of them. Okay, the first you dissolve the calcium oxide to calcium hydroxide, and which is the basically the adsorbing material, and then it goes through the bicarbonate and carbonate pathway to come to calcium carbonate and then finally give out the CO2. So the ideally, if you see that in the actual industrial process, what they do is they take slate, or they call it lime, right? So basically they form dissolve calcium oxide in water, bubble the CO2 gas through it, and then they form the precipitate of calcium bicarbonate and carbonate. Basically bicarbonate first, and then that bicarbonate they heat to get carbonate, and then again heat the carbonate to get the CO2 back and calcium oxide back. So there is a water mediated step in between.
Exactly. So I think we are running out of time, and it's maybe 2:20 something around at your place.
No, it's 2.
2. Okay. So it's quite a late at night, and if there is no other questions, I would request Professor Bhattacharya to make the concluding remarks about this seminar, and accordingly we should conclude today. Yeah. Bhattacharya.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you for your patience hearing. And thank you, Soumya for presenting such a lecture, which included detailed work regarding carbon dioxide reduction and the importance of this aspect. I think so today, good night to Soumya, and and also I think we can conclude today with such a sure.
Good day to rest of the all. Good day to rest of the all. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And we will again notify our next webinar very soon.
Thank you. Thank you once again for a nice talk, and have a nice time and stay safe there.
Right.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Okay. তো আমরা শেষ করছি আজকে আমাদের এখানে।
ধন্যবাদ। থ্যাংক ইউ।
Thank you.